this first portion of Unit 3 will cover the Texas Legislature. Now, if we just look at the basic fundamentals of the Texas Legislature, the basics of what it does, it is one of the three branches of government in the state of Texas, and exactly like the three branches of government on the national level. It is the legislature, and it combines in those three branches with the executive branch and the judiciary. And much like the federal at the federal level, though a little different, they do have a semblance of checks and balances where each kind of counteracts and checks the other one. It is the lawmaking branch of the government. The legislature makes the laws, the executive branch executes the laws or carries out the laws, and the judiciary adjudicates the laws or determines who breaks the laws and what the laws mean. In Texas government, and this is important to remember, in our system, the legislature is the most important and the most powerful branch of government. The Texas Legislature is bicameral, and bicameral means that it has two chambers or two bodies or two houses, however you want to, whatever term you want to use. But there are two groups, two legislative groups that must work together and in conjunction, much like the U.S. Congress, in order to pass legislation. One of the chambers is the Texas Senate. The Texas Senate has 31 total members. There are 31 senatorial districts in the state of Texas. They serve 4-year overlapping terms, and half of the membership is elected every 2 years. So what that means is your senator from your district may be up for election in 2016 and not be up for re-election again until 2020, whereas maybe a neighboring senatorial district, they were up for election in 2014, and then their re-election would be in 2018. The second year of each decade, all members must stand for re-election at the same time. So that means that some of them will only have served a 2-year term when they have to stand for re-election in that second year of the decade. Now, the Texas House of Representatives, which is the other chamber, it has 150 members. So compared to the Texas Senate, the House of Representatives districts would be smaller because there's 31 districts in the state of Texas geographically in the Senate, and so you would have to divide Texas up into 31 equal parts. And however many people are in those, that's the constituency of each senatorial member. In the House, there's 151, so they have to cover all the geographic area of Texas. So there will be smaller districts with fewer people in each of the 150 districts, and they all serve 2-year terms. So every 2 years, the entire 150-member House of Representatives is up for re-election. Now, when it comes to electing members of the legislature, Texas legislature uses single-member districts, meaning that there is only one person within each district that represents the interests of that district in the House of Representatives or in the Texas Senate. And so, if that person wins by 51% to 49%, the 49%, which is almost half of the district that lives there, they really are not represented if you want to determine it by party lines or party ideology, because the winner will represent their own party's interests for the most part. But anyway, so it's single-member districts. Each district has one representative. Now, as I said, that district chooses the one person in both the House and the Senate that will represent their interests in the legislature. Now, in 2010, and this may have changed, usually they change these every 10 years, so 2020 will probably be the next census where they change the number of persons that will be represented in each district. Of course, as the population grows, these numbers will rise because they're probably not going to increase the number of districts. So they'll just add redraw the districts to make sure that that's all evenly distributed in even numbers. Each House district represents about 173,476 citizens. That's the average. So really what you would do to get that number is, for the House Representatives, since there's 150 House districts, you would take the entire population of Texas, whatever that number is, and divide it by 150. The Senate district represents about 839,401 citizens, and you get that number by taking the total population of Texas and dividing it by 31, which is the number of senatorial districts. Here's a map of the state house districts, and they're color coded, so anything that's kind of the same color, it's got a little number in it, will represent a district. And as you can see, some of the urban areas, like if you look at the very bottom of the map around Brownsville, you look around Houston, Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, and El Paso, you see lots of numbers cobbled together there because the population is very condensed there. There's millions of people that live in some of these areas. And if a House district has 173,000 people, well, you're going to have a lot of House districts in a very small geographic area in Houston. So they draw those districts within the city. In other places like far west Texas, if you look at that District 74, the gray area along the Rio Grande River, I mean, there are in all those counties together, there's about 173,000 people. So it's very rural, the population is widely distributed, and there's not a lot of people living out there. Now here's the state Senate map. As you can see, there are fewer. There are just 31 state senatorial districts, so therefore you have more people in each. Therefore, they're going to be larger than the state house districts. Now let's talk about how they determine, where the district boundaries are and what these districts look like. The process of determining this is called reapportionment and redistricting. Reapportionment is the process of allocating congressional districts to the states, usually after the census. So what reapportionment means is, because population changes in each state, oftentimes some states will lose population after 10 years, every time there's a census. Some will gain seats. And now we're talking about the U.S. Congress and the U.S. representatives in the U.S. Congress. So they will, if Texas gains a significant amount of population for the census, they may gain U.S. congressional seats. Now, we're not talking about the Texas Legislature. Right now, we're talking about U.S., but this also factors into Texas. But Texas doesn't reapportion because they never change the number of House seats. The U.S. Congress does change the number of House seats in a state. Now, they don't change the number overall. There's always 435 in the U.S. House of Representatives. But if Texas adds one, that means another state will lose one. So if Texas gains enough population and Louisiana loses enough population, Texas may gain a U.S. House of Representatives seat, and Louisiana may lose one. The total numbers stay the same in the U.S. Congress, but there would be a changing of the numbers between the states. That's reapportionment. Now, redistricting is the redrawing of the districts to accommodate the reapportionment. And this happens in both in both Texas Legislature and in the U.S. House of Representatives. And basically what happens is, when you have more people living in Texas, you have to make sure that every district, the state legislative district and the U.S. districts, congressional districts, make sure that they have equal population. And people, when they move to a state, they don't move equally to every district. So you have to redraw the districts to make the populations in each of the districts equal. That is redistricting. So kind of know the difference between reapportionment, which is changing the number among the states, and redistricting, which is the actual redrawing of the districts to accommodate the changing number of people in your state, and making sure that all the districts have the same number of people. Both are constitutional mandates in the U.S. Constitution and the Texas Constitution. Now, this process of redistricting is very political because it can have long-term effects on the success or failure of political parties and or the political influence of certain groups, racial groups, ethnic groups, and religious groups, and political groups. Districts can be drawn by the state legislature, and that's who draws the districts. Districts can be drawn to benefit or harm incumbents and or parties. So you can draw a district that will help or hurt a political party, or help or hurt an ethnic group, or a racial group, or a religious group. And you do that because when you draw the districts, statistically, they have access, the legislators, people have access to information that tells them where most of the Democrats live, where most of the Republicans live, where most of the African Americans live, or Hispanics live, or whites live, where most of the Jewish people live. And they can draw districts to either help those groups, make sure they have lots of people in one of their districts, or harm them by spreading them out in such a way that they're not a majority in any district, therefore they cannot have any representation in a single member legislature. So it is a very, very political process, and it can be harmful or helpful to different individual groups. The practice of drawing a district for the sole purpose of either helping or harming a group is called gerrymandering. It's called gerrymandering, and it's generally considered illegal, but it's very hard to prove that somebody drew those districts for that purpose in the court of law. A couple of Supreme Court cases, Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sims, basically spelled out, or the U.S. Supreme Court stated that in these cases that all House Representatives districts and senatorial districts must be equal, because historically in the past you would have a House Representative districts that may have represent 50,000 people, and you have another House Representative district that represents 300,000 people, and that was determined to be unconstitutional, and it wasn't a fair representation and distribution of the vote. So Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sims. Now, what are the qualifications to be a state legislator in the state of Texas? Well, for the House of Representatives, in the state of Texas, you must be a U.S. citizen, you must be a registered voter, you must be 21 years old, that's pretty young, and you must have lived in the state of Texas for 2 years prior to the election, and in the district for 1 year prior to the election. Now, for the Texas Senate, you have to be a U.S. citizen, registered voter, and 26 years old. You got to be a little bit older. You have to have lived in the state for 5 years and the district for 1 year. Now, birthright characteristics, these are kind of the unofficial qualifications for a district. Most people who run in a district, generally with certain birthright characteristics, look like their constituents. They're usually of the majority race, religion, kind of background, farming or urban or whatever. If you have a district that's 80% Hispanic or 80% African American or 80% Anglo, generally the elected official from that district will be Anglo, African American or Hispanic. Now, where they differ in these unofficial categories is that even though they may be of the same racial or ethnic or religious background, generally those that are elected to the legislature have higher education levels and are wealthier than the average constituent in their district. So representatives are different than the population with regard to their income and education, but they're very similar with regard to their birthright characteristics, which things they are born with. And statistically right now, racial minorities and women are underrepresented in the Texas legislature. That means that, you know, with regard to what their percentage is in the population, take women, for example, they're half the population, but they're not nearly close to being half the members of the legislature. That's why we say they're underrepresented. In a perfect world, if there was perfect representation, because women are half of the population, women would be half of the legislature. You know, Hispanics make up about 37 to 39% of the population right now. In a perfectly representative legislature, they would also make up about 39% of the state legislature, which they don't. Now let's talk about the electoral process and getting elected to the state legislature. Just like anything else, any other elected office, money is usually the deciding factor in winning or losing elections. The statistics show, and it's not perfect, it's not a perfect statistical um, arrangement, but usually whoever raises the most money and spends the most money in any election wins the election. So fundraising is vital to winning elections. So if you're planning on running for election, unless you're independently wealthy, you will probably have to spend a significant amount of your time raising money. Now, of course, with that comes obligations. People that give you money, especially individuals or interest groups that give you a lot of money, they expect something in return when you get into the legislature. They expect you to vote and present bills on their behalf. So you need fundraising. You need to make money. Also, you need advertising, and that's very expensive. That's tied in with the fundraising and tied in with the money. Television ads, especially in statewide elections, but even in these senatorial elections or state house elections, if you're in an area that is densely populated, advertising on television especially can be very expensive, and in newspapers. Uh, and Texas districts are large compared to some other states, so you have to advertise. If you go back and look at those maps, some of those districts are so large, and you have to reach all the voters in your advertising in that district. So that means you have to advertise in all those different towns, all those different local newspapers, maybe run radio ads, and if some of those areas have television stations, you run television ads. Now, for the most part, right now in the state of Texas, uh, the um, the districts have been drawn in such a way that there's not a lot of competition in the House or Senate races. You have your safe Democratic districts, which are drawn or gerrymandered, if you will, to make sure that Democrats win those districts. Then you have safe Republican districts, which are drawn or gerrymandered to ensure that Republicans win those districts. So they draw them in such a way to where they know that about maybe 60 or 70% of the population votes Democratic or Republican. And therefore they know that whoever, you know, that district will be a safe district for that political party. Competitive districts, there's not a whole lot of competitive districts. If there are, oftentimes they're in um, urban areas where there's a lot of mixture of more diversity of the population. There is and there's a high turnover in the state legislature in the state of Texas. People, you know, there are some that have been there a long time and they love serving in the legislature, but many of them don't serve very long. And the reasons include poor pay. $7,200 is the annual pay with a per diem when you're in Austin. Because you only, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the legislature only meets every other year officially in session, every other year, and even numbered years. Um, for 140 days. There's lack of staff assistance, although that's changing recently. Indeed, redistricting causes people to get frustrated with the political process, and there's a lot of demands on to the job. Even if it's not in session, you still have to work in your with your constituency and with your staff to get things done. All right. Now, the Texas Legislature does not have term limits. Just like the governor's office in the state of Texas, you can run as many times as you want as long as your constituents continue to reelect you. So there are no term limits. Now, the Texas Legislature has biennial sessions. Both the House and the Senate meet every other year. They meet every other year, every 2 years, and they meet for 140 days per year. So it's really a part-time legislature for a huge, diverse state. And I would argue personally that it's a detriment to the state of Texas to have a part-time legislature. We should have a full-time legislature that meets every year, but that's my opinion. Also, according to the Constitution, the legislature must adjourn at the end of regular session and may not continue to meet, even if they have issues or problems that have not been resolved. They must adjourn at the end of the legislative session. So that puts a lot of pressure on them to make sure that they get all their stuff that they need to get done, make sure they get them done in a timely manner. The legislature may not call itself into special session. A special session is a session separate from the regular session that they meet. And usually a special session is called to address a significant problem that must be addressed by the legislature. Oftentimes it's dealt with things like school funding, but the Texas Legislature itself cannot call itself into special session. Only the governor can do that. So if the governor doesn't feel like something is important enough to call a special session, even if the legislature does, then they won't be called into special session. Only the governor may call a special session. Now, the salary for a Texas House and Texas Senate member is $7,200 per year. That is not very much money at all. Most people can't live on $7,200 a year. Even a single person would have a hard time living on $7,200 a year. But that being said, when you are in Austin in session, for each day that you are in session, you receive $139 per day per diem, a daily stipend for that time. Because when you're in Austin, most people aren't in Austin all the time. They don't live in Austin. They live in their districts, which are scattered all over Texas. So when the legislature is in session, they must go to Austin and live there while the legislature is in session. And they get $139 a day for that. And while that may sound like quite a bit of money, if you stay in a hotel, that's about the entire amount that a decent hotel in Austin is going to cost you. So basically it just pays for just a place to stay. And of course, when you take the salary and per diem and compare it to other states, the Texas legislative salaries are very low compared to other large states. But that's a tradition in Texas. That's part of our culture, is that we don't trust legislators and the government in general, and we don't want people making, getting comfortable or getting wealthy just being a legislator. That being said, there are very, very good retirement benefits, and you don't have to work in the legislature very long to receive these benefits.